been in a little series about the book of James, which is one of those books in the New Testament, short, snappy, punchy, and extremely practical. And we've been thinking a little bit about the implications of reading the Bible and what it means for us today. And so we get to the next little bit of James chapter 2, which is verses 14 and onwards. We overlap a little bit with what the excellent stuff that Vicky said last week. But if you've got your Bibles with you, you might want to open them or turn the Bibles on and turn to James chapter 2, because we're going to look at what James says about faith finding its way to your fingertips. And if you need a little recap on the book of James, then check this out.
The letter of James, or at least that's his name in English. If you look in the Greek, you will see that his name is Jakobos, which translates his Hebrew name Yaakov. And that's why most ancient and modern translations render his name as Jacob. And that's what we're going to call him in this video. Now, there are many Jacobs in the New Testament. 2 of them belong to Jesus' inner circle of the 12 disciples, but this letter comes from the Jacob who was the half-brother of Jesus himself. Now, we learn this Jacob story from the book of Acts and from Paul's letters. After Peter moved on from Jerusalem to go start new churches, Jesus' half-brother Jacob rose to prominence as a leader in the mother church in Jerusalem. It was made up mostly of Messianic or Christian Jews. This was the first Christian community ever, and we know that it fell on hard times during the 20 years that Jacob was its leader. There was a famine that led to great poverty in the region, and these Messianic Jews were being persecuted by Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. But through it all, Jacob was known as a pillar of the Jerusalem church. He was also known as a peacemaker who led with wisdom and courage until he was tragically murdered. And in this book, we have the legacy of Jacob's teaching and wisdom condensed into a short and very powerful work.
The book of James, or maybe we ought to call it the book of Jacob. If you know any Jacobs, then do let him know that he should really be called James. This passage from James chapter 2, it thrusts us into thinking about faith as more than just a set of principles, a set of beliefs, if you like. It is, by definition, a description of the real thing. What does faith actually look like? In the 1940s, the brand manager of Coke said this about Coca-Cola: young people seek the real thing. Of course, it was Coca-Cola's way of quashing any attack on their dominance of the marketplace, which had begun to develop. They went on, of course, to also to sell the color red for Christmas. There you go. That's why Santa is in red. If you see him, it's Coke's fault. The real thing, Coca-Cola. And in this passage this evening, we're thinking a little bit about Jesus Christ, the real thing. In the AD 50s, James, Jesus' brand manager, said this: all people seek the real thing. The Christian church has a responsibility, I think, to develop and to live life in faith as the real thing. Not simply a set of principles or even a set of beliefs, but faith finding its way to the fingertips, the real thing. So what does James say about faith and action? Here's a few thoughts from the passage that we're going to look at in a second. Firstly, it's this: faith is not just something that you say. Here's James 2, verses 14 to 17. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, James wrote, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. Strong words, isn't it, by the book of James? Not that faith is marginalized or that faith is mildly unimportant, but that faith without action is dead. Check this little bit from verse 14. If someone claims to have faith but has no deeds, faith is not just something you say. Of course, faith is something that you say. I mean, we're called to explain the Christian faith, to talk about it, to share Jesus, to make statements of what we say that we believe. But it's not simply what you say. It's more than that. It's more than simply the words that we might speak. If faith was just the creed, faith would be dead. When the creed finds its way to our fingertips, alters the way that we think or act, we believe, then something dynamic happens. Faith is not just something that you say. The real thing is more than that. Faith, secondly, in this passage, is not just something that you feel. Here's the passage again. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? It goes on in verse 16, but does nothing about their physical needs. What good is it? Faith is not just something you say, you speak out, you state. Faith is not just something that you feel. Now, the Anglican Church is not overly given to lots of emotionalism and feelings. But there are moments when we come to worship when we sense God's presence and we feel something. And I think that can be a good thing. We want our worship to be a moment of encounter with Jesus, don't we? We want to know that he loves us, to experience that in the context of our worship. That's why we do things as we do them at St. Michael's, so that we can have a moment, some time to reflect, to wait on God and to sense his call upon our lives, his presence, if you will. But faith can't be just that. It can't just be something that we feel, because feelings will come and go. The things that we feel today, we may not feel tomorrow. I've been amazed at how many conversations in our staff team have gone like this. We seemed to do exactly the same thing this Sunday as we did last Sunday, and yet last Sunday there was an amazing sense of God's presence, and yet this Sunday it seemed to be a bit harder work. Maybe you've had that experience in church. You come one week and you go, wow, that was amazing. And then another week you go, meh. You may be feeling that even now as you're listening at home or here. Faith has got to be more than just feeling, because our feelings come and go. They change. James said this, what if you simply say, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but do nothing about physical needs? What good is it? I love what it says in the book of John. It has this little phrase in 1 John chapter 3. It says this, dear children, John wrote, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. Faith is not just something you feel, it's something you do. You act upon. You live out. The little story that I told earlier on of trekking up to London on Thursday was, it impacted me in lots of ways. Partly because I met people that I'd never met before who seemed to have their lives turned around because of a series of relationships that they had engaged with a bunch of passionate youth workers and people that were committed to walking with people through thick and thin. But it struck me that it was a story of, or a variety of stories that I heard that were practical. People walking, people making a difference, people turning up when they needed to turn up, people praying and then putting their prayers into action. Not just the feeling. It's got to be more than that. It's got to be action. We'll come back to that in a second, because sometimes there's a little bit of misunderstanding, isn't there, about surely being a Christian is about having faith in Jesus. And yet you seem to be saying somehow that the faith that we have in Jesus needs to be practiced. It's got to be, you've got to do something in order to be saved. We'll come back to that in a second. Not just something you say, not just something that you feel. If we say to people, go well, keep warm and well fed, but do nothing, what good, what difference does that make? We're called, I think, to live something different out, to model something different in the way that we are. Not just something we say, not just something that we feel, not just something that we think. Here's that passage as it goes on. Someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds. You believe that there is one God. Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. You foolish person, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? And he goes on in a minute. I will show you my faith by my deeds. Faith is more than just something that you think. Now, thinking is important. Those of you here who might be more academic, people who are at Bible college or study, who read the scriptures, etc., that's important. But even Jesus said, you think that by reading the scriptures, you have eternal life, and yet you refuse to come to the one who brings it. Faith is more than just what you think. Can you see that we're heading in a direction where faith is about what we believe finding its way to our fingertips? You have faith, I have deeds. James says, show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by what I do. I was reading, and it depends on what you read and what website you look at, but there are some quite shocking statistics in the UK and in the Western church particularly about what people say they believe and what people then say that they do. Those two things often seem quite far apart. So we might pray for the poor, the lost, the lonely, the hurting, and yet most of the church seems to care less about that. I think for us as a church, we want to somehow bring closer together the connection between who we believe in and what he calls us to do as we live it out. The community of Stoke Gifford has changed drastically over the last 35 years. For those of you that have lived here for that long, you'll know that there are significant changes. All of our green fields are now filled with houses, or at least will be in the next 5 to 10 years. The way that the affordability of housing, etc., across this area has changed significantly. There are opportunities for us to put faith into action. Not just to say that we believe, but to live it out. There are opportunities that we have as a church to care for those that we may not have ever come across before in our lives. It seems to me that faith finds its way to the fingertips. It says, Jesus, you've called me to yourself. Now, what are you calling me to do? What impact do you want me to have in my life? Who are you calling me to stand with, to stand alongside, to advocate on behalf of? Faith always finds its way to the fingertips. one of the most impactful moments in my leadership was being part of Soul Survivor, which was a big conference that used to run every summer for many years. It stopped a few years ago, working particularly with young people. And for a while, I was involved in sort of behind the scenes with Soul Survivor and speaking occasionally at various things. One of the moments that was most impactful for me, and it did change, I think, the way that I thought about this Bible passage, was somebody who came to talk about the need in the two-thirds world. They'd been to sub-Saharan Africa. They'd seen the needs there. They'd came back. They were talking about it. They were talking about projects that they wanted to run. They were talking about a number of things that they were encouraging us to get involved in. And in one of the evening celebrations, I don't know, there were about 5,000 young people at this thing. There was worship, and then this guy got up and spoke, talked about where he'd been, talked about the projects he'd love to set up, talked about the need. And then he said, and we need to do something, because people in this part of Africa where I've been to, when I went recently, you should see how many people didn't have shoes. And everybody went, yeah, that we can believe that. That sounds dreadful. And then he said, wouldn't it be amazing if we could give people 5,000 pairs of shoes? And everybody looked at each other. And I could see the guys that were in my youth group look at each other with a sense of, we know where this is going. And he said, listen, why don't you go back to your tents? In a couple of minutes, we're going to pause the celebration. You're going to go back to your tent or your caravan if you're lucky enough, or B&B in my place because I was a leader. You're going to go back to your residence. You're going to find your favorite pair of shoes, and I'd like you to bring them back and donate them. So a bunch of people just kind of bent down like that and untied their shoes. And these are new, by the way. And took their shoes off where they were. Some people took their shoes off, left it in the celebration, went back in their feet or their socks to their tent to get another pair of shoes. And when they came back to the tent, people came back with their favorite pair of shoes, their best pair, and held their shoes whilst the person on the platform said, well done for getting your shoes, let's pray. And we had this weird moment where we all held pairs of shoes and we prayed. And we said, Lord, would these get to somebody who really needs them? And at that moment, behind the stage, like here, there was a big double door, a bit like our double doors over there on the side. And once everybody come back, you heard this rumble of noise, and they opened the double doors like that, and there were 3 Arctic lorries out the back, massive things. And they opened the doors of these lorries, and everybody came up on the platform onto the stage, went through the double doors and placed their shoes in the lorries, in these trucks. And then came back in, and we prayed as we watched 5,000 pairs of shoes go from Shepton Mallet straight out to sub-Saharan Africa. It was a moment that changed my life, actually, not simply because it was one pair of shoes that went, but because it was a call to put faith into action. For those of you who have been around St. Michael's long enough, you'll know that something of that kind of lives in me. Faith into action. Faith has to find its way to our fingertips. Someone says, you have faith, I have deeds. In other words, I'm just a thinker. I'm a person that just thinks. I think James says, no, you can't be. You can't just think it. You've got to live it. You've got to do it. Faith into action. I remember the look of horror here. One Christmas, going back about 10 years or so, when we said to people in a church service, we are going to, this Christmas, deliver our Christmas cards by hand. And in our Sunday services, talked about it, said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to deliver our Christmas cards by hand. And everybody went, that sounds like a really good idea, which was a way of saying, I'll be praying for you as you go and do it. And those of you who were there might remember, we then said, right, let's go. Like now, let's go. And we stopped the church service and everybody got up. Everybody was like, what? You mean like actually go now? Yeah. You mean you're not going to finish your sermon? I was like, no, that's it. 2-minute sermon. Now we're going to go and do it. And we got up, we grabbed Christmas cards, and we went out from the old church building, and we went out into the community to distribute Christmas cards. And then we came back to tell stories of what happened when we gave Christmas cards out. Faith has to find its way to our fingertips. You have faith, but I have deeds is not a phrase we should be hearing or speaking or thinking. It's more than just thinking. And then as this passage goes on, it's not just something you believe. Faith is not just something you say. It's not just something you feel. It's not just something you think. It's not even just something that you believe. James goes on in this passage, doesn't he, and says, you have faith, I have deeds. And then he says, look, you believe that there is one God. Good, well done. But did you know even the demons believe that and shudder? In other words, you can believe something, but does it find its way to your fingertips? You can believe that Jesus rescued you, but do you receive that truth? You can believe all manner of things, but does it find its way into practice? It's not just about belief. Faith has to find its way to our fingertips. I was hearing a story this morning. Somebody was saying to me in church that they'd been going through a really tough time, and the day that they were feeling most down, in the moment that they were feeling it, they received 2 texts from 2 WhatsApp messages from people in church that kind of said, one was a Bible verse that said, the Lord is with you and the Lord will never abandon you. The other was a little message that just said, we're with you in the moments. If you, just to let you know, keep going. We're 2 very simple messages that changed that person's day because it was faith into action. It was finding its way to the smartphone to deliver something to a person who in the moment felt really under attack. And somebody then sent a message. Are we listening enough to the Lord in our days to think, do you know what, maybe I'll just send a little message to this person in this moment? To trust God enough that he would cause faith to find its way to your fingertips as you type a text or a WhatsApp or an Insta post. Will we allow faith to find its way to our fingertips? Faith is more than just what we believe. Faith has to be lived out. And it seems to me that's what the book of James is about. It's not just something you say, not just something you feel, not just something you think, not just something you believe, because even demons will believe that God is God. It has to find its way to being lived out. This passage from the book of James explains an example of that. It goes on to talk about Abraham and Rahab. It says, they were considered righteous by what they did and not just by faith alone. You see, it is true that we are rescued by faith in Jesus alone. Paul talked about that in all of his letters. We are rescued, saved by faith in Jesus alone. But the faith that we have in Jesus that saves us is never alone. It always finds its way to fingertips, to action, to movement, to making a difference. That's why we have that in our vision statement. We're called to make a difference, one person at a time, one sense, one call of God at a time. We're called to make a difference. Something has to change. Faith is lived out. In this passage from the book of James, he talks about two characters, Abraham and Rahab, two opposite ends of the spectrum. One old guy, established, beard-wearing, leader, father of Israel, bedrock of faith. And at the other end of the spectrum, Rahab, woman, younger, prostitute, person working in Jericho, person who protected two or three spies sent by Joshua, person that put their faith into practice. And it's like James is saying, okay, look at these two opposite ends of the spectrum, these two people, Abraham and Rahab. You see that this person considered righteous by what they do and not simply by faith alone. These words, I think, from this passage should haunt us. They haunt me every time I read them because I'm a person that speaks faith a lot. I'm a person that thinks faith a lot. I'm a person that feels faith in Jesus a lot. And yet Jesus through James says, "Si, that's all right, but it's not enough. Has to find its way to your fingertips. It has to find its way out into the lives of others. You have to not just say in the moment, yes, I'm a Christian, but am I sensitive to the call of God in any moment that I might live out the Christian life in a way that impacts even just one other person?" Faith, then, is not just something you say, not just something you feel, not just something you think, not even just something that you believe. It's something that is lived out. All of us are here probably because at some point you've seen the Christian life lived out beside you with someone else. When somebody's impacted your life, looked out for you, prayed for you, cared for you, given you something, enabled you to stretch forward into all that God has for you. It's because it's lived out that we see it. It was lived out by Jesus, who came, God with us, to say, this is what God is like. Will you step up? Will you step forward and follow me? And on this gift day, we have the most amazing opportunity to put faith into action. Faith to our fingertips, if you like. We have an opportunity in a moment's time to say, I'm going to trust God, not just in a series of statements or beliefs or feelings, but because I'm going to trust him enough to step towards what he calls me to, and particularly to step towards what he wants me to give, to partner with him in. As you saw from that video, God's work happens because we partner with him in giving. The mission partners that we support are supported because we, as individuals, give. And out of that, we as a church give away 10% of everything that we raise to others. It's true across the board, whether it's the mission and ministry, whether it's the heart of the community project, our buildings and resources, everything that we raise, we're committed to giving 10% of it away. Why? Because faith has to find its way to your fingertips. And we use our fingertips by reaching into our pockets and finding our phones and double-clicking on the side and waiting for the Face ID to recognize you and hoping that you've got the right glasses on so that it does recognize you, and tapping your phone somewhere that says, I believe in Jesus this much, this much, this much, this much. I will give because all of Jesus has given to me, and I will bless somebody else by the giving that I give, by the generosity that I live by putting faith into the fingertips, faith into action. Otherwise, all we have is a series of statements, a creed that we stand by, something that we look at, a book that we might read that says, wow, that was interesting, but nothing that changes anything. No individual, no community. And so we're called, I think, it's a rallying cry to make a difference. Your life does count. The impact of your faith does count. I met several people on Thursday who I'd never met before, who I couldn't have foreseen 20 years ago, who said to me, because of what you had faith for 20 years ago, I am here. That story would be multiplied across this room 100 times with the people that you have impacted, people that you met when they were teenagers and they remember you, the work that you did in a camp in 1994. You will have impacted somebody's life. The summer club that you took part in the summer, where an 8-year-old discovered Jesus or saw you praying for them or heard you point them in the direction of some hope or encourage their family towards a food bank. Someone will be impacted because of the difference that we make. And it's what Jesus calls us to. It's why we're here as a church. And it's why we give. All the stories of those people on the screen who are encouraging us that our gift can make a difference. I really believe that to be true. When we give, people's lives are impacted. If we don't give, less will happen.